Thank you so much for reading. May I add my welcome. It's lovely to see you here. We're going to be looking at that reading now, so if you keep that page open. And our subject this morning is power. And I want us to think about the route to power, because our passage contains one of the most bold claims to absolute power and all authority that you'll find in the whole of the Bible. It's there in verse 64. Jesus said to the high priest, "You have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So you'll know that Matthew's Gospel finishes with the words from the risen Jesus, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." But these words in verse 64 are at least on a par with that claim. And I want us to see this morning both how and why Jesus can claim to have been given such a position by God. I guess studies in the route to power abound. Vast sums of money are spent on power. I'm told the last United States election cost an estimated $2.4 billion. And this week, George Soros has spent £400,000 on what might be considered to be an attempt to influence power. I'm sure we could argue that the decisions we take with regard to where we think the power lies ultimately answer for us the question on which side of history we will stand. But the power we're speaking of this morning is not temporal or terrestrial. Human power is one thing, and we're talking here about something very different. Jesus says in verse 64, "You'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power," and it's a claim to divine power. And our author, Matthew, wants us to see that the route to this power that is given to Jesus, which he now has and exercises, is through the cross. So over these 10 weeks, between Christmas and Easter, we are seeking instruction from Matthew as to what the death and resurrection of Jesus means. And Matthew's a fine place for us to go for our teaching, because the earliest church records have it that Matthew's was the first of the Gospels to be recorded, and that Matthew, Levi, the disciple, was commissioned along with the other disciples to record the fact and meaning of Jesus' life. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all share essentially the same material. This is the least altered material between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And thus, over these 10 weeks, we're returning to the authentic and the apostolic understanding of the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's not simply, as one or two people have said, that we're working our way through the passion narrative. It's much more significant than that. What we're looking at is the authorized theology, the set understanding of the church as to why Jesus died and what it means. Now, of course, we could go to the epistles to be instructed about the cross, and we would find apostolic instruction. Most of the epistles were written to correct error. We could go to the writings of the early church leaders, or to the confessions and creeds of the various councils, or we could go to the 16th, 17th, 18th, even 20th century theologians to be instructed about the cross. But for basic Christianity, for key stage 1 and PhD advanced studies on the cross, what better place to go than Matthew's Gospel, where Matthew was trained by Jesus to give us the authorized understanding and theology for the church of the cross of Christ. It's a wonderful place for us to be. Indeed, the biblical authors are the authorized and only authorized theologians for the church. And so we could say, where did you get your instruction on the atonement, on the death of Jesus? And as we study Matthew's Gospel, we're saying, well, actually, I got it from Jesus. Because this is Jesus' authorized account of why he died and what it means. I was talking to the leader of our Sunday school about this just before the service started. And he said, isn't it interesting? We think if you're going to understand the cross of Jesus, you've got to have read, the cross of Christ, or the Apostolic Teaching of the Church by Leon Morris, or something like that. rather than I've studied Matthew's account, and the theologian Matthew has taught me his systematic theology, if you like, of why Jesus died. So I hope you are really absorbing what we're studying and allowing it to shape your understanding of the cross, because this is what Jesus instructed to be taught about his death. So we're in the area of power today, and we're going to look particularly at verse 64 in due course, but I want us to look at the claim and the route to absolute divine power, and then ask which side of history we stand on. Now, the events recorded in verse 57 to 68 chart one of the most famous kangaroo courts in history. Matthew tells us in verse 58 that Peter, following at a distance, as far as the court of the high priest, went inside to sit with the guards. Do you see what it says? To see the end. You wonder what was going through Peter's mind at that point. Speaks of him kind of expecting, well, this is it. Surely Matthew's intention is that those who consider ourselves to be disciples, as it were, sit with with Peter rather. And we can picture Peter with a camera observing everything that took place in the high priest's court. And from Peter's perspective, as he waited to see the end, there would be only one answer as to where the power lay. Because the high priest, Caiaphas, together with the scribes and elders, made up what was known as the Sanhedrin, the governing council. There were 71 in all, and it's not at all appropriate to compare the Sanhedrin with a largely irrelevant Church of England General Synod. Israel at that time was an occupied theocracy in the Roman Empire. The Sanhedrin was a massively powerful and significant political, theological, legal gathering. Leading churchmen, political and aristocratic elite, the legal establishment. It seems that attempts by the chief priests and the whole council, the Sanhedrin, to find false testimony against Jesus had been continuing for some time. Just look at verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council, that's the Sanhedrin, were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. 2 witnesses were needed by law in Jewish courts to convict a person, and 2 witnesses could not be found, even false ones, over an extended period they looked. Eventually, they unearthed 2 men who accused Jesus of a crime that is tantamount to blasphemous treason. Verse 60, the end of the verse. At last, 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." Of course, the temple was the epicenter of all Jewish national identity and spiritual life. To threaten to strike the temple was to threaten not only to strike at the heart of the nation, but at the heart of God. The temple represented the presence of God, pardon from God, the praise of God. What is more, I don't know if you knew this, but the Old Testament prophets had promised that it was God's king who would rebuild the temple. Zechariah chapter 6. And therefore the claim to destroy the temple and rebuild it was implicitly a claim to messiahhood. So the charge is far greater than simply one of kind of supernatural demolition and a supernatural rebuild. It's a charge to tyranny, a charge to sedition, a charge of blasphemy. And in the face of these trumped-up allegations, Jesus does what any sensible person would do. He applies the 5th Amendment. At last, 2 came forward and said, verse 62, the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is this that these men testify against you?" Jesus remains silent. Remember Isaiah 53, the silence of the Lamb. Now, at this stage, I wonder where you think power lies. Here is Jesus bound, falsely accused, standing as a common criminal, or you might say an uncommon criminal, before the most exalted court of his day. And as Peter watches from a distance to see the end, he will witness Jesus being spat upon and struck and slapped in the face and taunted and mocked. Where would you think power lies with the Sanhedrin, these 71 legal, political figures, or this, what appears to be, pathetic figure, bound, weak? The high priest knows his Zechariah, and therefore, because a claim to be the one who destroys and then rebuilds the temple is a claim of messianic proportions, the high priest subjects Jesus to a binding oath that Jesus is legally bound to answer. And so, verse 63, the high priest said to him, I adjure you, that's a solemn commitment, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And now Jesus, if he's to fulfill all righteousness, is bound to reply. He's been sworn to it. And this is where I want us to pause. Verse 64, it's a claim of extraordinary proportions, amongst the most exalted claim in the whole of the Bible, and it contains 4 elements, and I want to unpack each one. You have said so, says Jesus in verse 64, but I tell you from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the cloud of heaven. So what Jesus does is to apply to himself the title, the Son of Man, to say of himself, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, to use of himself the phrase, and coming on the clouds of heaven, and to announce, from now on, the title. The title Son of Man can simply refer to a human being. Ezekiel uses it like that, a child of Adam, someone like you or me. But in the book of Daniel and in the Psalms, the Son of Man is used to refer to God's king. And particularly in the book of Daniel, the title is used to give to God's chosen king the most exalted position in the universe on the day of judgment. The Son of Man, then, is human. It links the king to Adam. The Son of Man is royal. It links Adam to the king. The Son of Man is in the book of Daniel, assumes divine status. And so the Son of Man links the Son of God, the king, to God the Son, the Lord. Let's turn back to page 900, please, and to the passage from which this title comes. Page 900. Now you can see the scene in verses 9 and 10. Here is Daniel. It's a vision. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head were like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. It's a scene of majesty and royal rule and judgment. And then you can see the Son of Man there in verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, that is to the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So the Son of Man is given a position by the Ancient of Days. The position is of dominion and glory and a kingdom. Dominion speaks of power and of a realm of rule. Glory speaks of honor and splendor. And kingdom speaks of royal identity and royal reign. But look at verse 14. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. So the purpose of his royal rule is that all peoples, all nations, all languages should serve this king, and the duration of his royal reign is everlasting. It's universal rule, it's eternal. So then both high and low, both rich and poor, both Jew and Gentile, both black and white, both Asian and Indian, the Mandarin speaker, the French worker, the Eastern European migrant, the Singaporean student, every single one will bow before this king and worship him for all eternity, the Son of Man. The phrase, seated at the right hand of power, back in Matthew chapter 26, keep a finger in Daniel, we're going to go back that, but the phrase, seated at the right hand of power, not only picks up on Daniel 7, where one like a son of man is presented before the Ancient of Days, it is also a direct allusion to Psalm 110 that we read together earlier. Jesus has already referenced Psalm 110 in the dispute with the leaders of Israel back in chapter 22. Psalm 110 begins, as we read, like this. The Lord, that's God in heaven, says to my Lord, that's some third party other than David, the king, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So then great King David had in mind that God the Father would enthrone some figure apart from God the Father, alongside God the Father, in a position of absolute divine authority and power. And this figure would have all his enemies brought by God under his authoritative rule for all eternity. And this figure would reign and rule over every vanquished foe in royal, divine, everlasting, priestly dynasty. Now, can you see, combined with Daniel 7, the image of the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power, Psalm 110, God, the Ancient of Days, takes the Son of Man, grants him all authority. It is a claim of stupendous proportions. It's impossible to illustrate it. I was thinking, well, how do you illustrate this kind of image? It is nothing compares. All earthly reigns come and go. They arrive with great pretension. They end in ultimate deterioration. Elizabeth I, gone. Victoria, gone. Kennedy, Carter, Ford, Clinton, Bush, Obama. Well, not all gone, but dynasty's over. Maggie, despite the desires of some, gone. Whether we think of Alexander the Great, or Genghis Khan, or Caesar Augustus, or Ming or Mao, gone. One of my neighbours runs clubs in London that have been, for years, popular with the celebrities and greats. And he was telling me over supper that Muhammad Ali used to visit his club. And he used to meet him and talk to him. Charisma, power, magnetic attraction, and then he talked about the last time that Ali turned up. The phrase, and coming on the clouds, requires very close attention. So, Jesus says, I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. This requires very careful attention. We're in Daniel 7 already, so look at verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. How does this Son of Man come to the Ancient of Days? On the clouds. And because this is a scene of ultimate and final judgment, and because in the New Testament Jesus and the apostles refer to his second coming by saying he will come on the clouds, people have tended generally to understand when Jesus says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds, it refers to his second coming. I don't think it can. For Jesus begins the statement to Caiaphas by saying, from now on, you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds. And the phrase from now on is a specific reference from this point to this point in time. And so it seems that what Jesus is doing is combining both his coming to the Father in the ascension following his death and resurrection and his return from the Father at his second coming. In other words, to Caiaphas, from now on you're just going to see one thing and one thing only: the Son of Man enthroned, reigning and ruling at the Father's right hand, and the Son of Man returning on the day of judgment. Now, I hope you're beginning to see just how remarkable what Jesus' response to Caiaphas is. He is fulfilling all righteousness in his obedience to the high priest who's put him under oath. By quoting from Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, he is providing for us the clearest interpretation of his death and resurrection and what it must mean in terms of his rule. He is the Son of Man, the one who will be invested with all power and authority in heaven and on earth. He is seated at the right hand of power. He's been given this position by God the Father to rule and to reign over all his enemies in royal priestly dynasty for eternity. He has come to the Father on the clouds. From the moment of his death and resurrection, as he ascends to the Father, from that moment on, he rules at the Father's right hand. And he will come from the Father on the clouds at the end of time in judgment. And so from now on, from this point in time, from the specific date of Passover and the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension of the Lord Jesus in 33 AD, he rules, he reigns, and peoples from every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every language will surrender and submit to his eternal and everlasting rule. Jesus is enthroned. And Jesus' dominion will be an everlasting dominion that will never pass away. And Jesus' kingdom will be an eternal kingdom and an indestructible kingdom that will never be eradicated. And from now on, we have either BC, before Christ, or not after Christ, but Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. From this point forward, you just have the kingdom of Jesus, and that's it. Kingdoms come, kingdoms go, empires rise, empires fall. Presidents, prime ministers, cabinets, and congresses are elected, and presidents, prime ministers, cabinets, and congresses are deposed. But from now on, says Jesus, enthroned in heaven, Jesus Christ. On my 40th birthday, which I'm not going to tell you how long ago it was now, I received one birthday card from a member of staff who is now gone. He didn't go summarily. He probably should have done. And all he drew was a picture of a mountain, a little hill like this, with an arrow underneath, happy 40th birthday, an arrow of travel, and he put a stick man on top of the mountain, facing in the direction downhill. It's all downhill from here on in, was the message. Well, you can make your own judgment over the last X number of years, but that was his assessment. He's gone. But, you know, from the moment a person assumes power, it seems that the basic direction of travel is deterioration, not Jesus. From now on, his kingdom stretches across eternity, down through time. There is the claim. What of the root? Because you have to agree, whether you're, whoever you are this morning, that this figure witnessed by Jesus is a figure, on the face of it, of pathetic weakness, impotence, folly. So how is this individual who says, from now on you will see, bound and silenced, spat on and struck, taunted and mocked, whipped and pinned to a cross, how is this individual going to reach this position of extraordinary power if his claim is true? What you'll notice is that so far, what we've done effectively is to take Matthew chapter 26, verse 64, and lift it out from Matthew's presentation of the death of Jesus, where Matthew, as our theologian, is instructing us in his seminary on the authentic apostolic meaning of the cross. We've just lifted the verse out, and we pretty much could have given this talk without much reference to what's going on all around it. Matthew will not have that. Matthew has verse 64 and this claim of Jesus right in the guts of his explanation of Jesus' death. He has welded it within his systematic theology, if you like, of the death of Jesus Christ. In other words, Matthew the theologian, in his module on the atonement, wants us to recognize not only Jesus' claim to power, but also the root. What then is the root of Jesus Christ to this position of absolute power, and a position before whom you will one day bow, I will one day bow, we are commanded today to bow? What is the root? Well, have you been here for the last 5 weeks? Chapter 26, verses 1 to 16. It's through the wicked greed of Judas as he betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Chapter 26, verse 17 through 29, it's through Jesus' death as the Passover lamb in which he gave his life as a substitutionary sacrifice for the sins of his people to redeem them out of slavery to Satan. What is the root? It's through his death inaugurating a new covenant such that we can be in relationship with the living God. What is the root? It's through him being denied by his disciples who demonstrate themselves unable to stand by him. What is the root? Chapter 26, verse 36 to 46. It's through his resolute determination to drink the cup of God's wrath on behalf of his frail and feeble disciples. What is the root? It's through his willingness as the obedient Son to submit himself to the Father's will, and through his readiness not to call on 60,000 angels that are at his disposal just a moment's distance away. It's through his silence before the high priest as he is led like a lamb to the slaughter as God the Son of Man, the Son of God, in order to carry God's judgment at the sinful wickedness of humanity, so that he drinks the cup of God's wrath, the last milliliter of God's anger at human sin as he hangs there on the cross, so that his people can be freed from under the judgment of God. So that as Peter stands watching, as Jesus goes alone to the cross, and as Peter, as we'll see next week, stands flawed, so Jesus goes flawless. And as Peter stands guilt-ridden, so Jesus goes innocent. And as Peter stands in cowardice, so Jesus goes in courage. And as Peter stands weak, so Jesus goes in integrity and power. The route to all power for God the Son is through his wrath-satisfying, sin-bearing death on behalf of his people. But what about routes to power? You see, Jesus' kingdom is made up of people from every nation, language, and from across the globe who have been made right with God through his wrath-bearing sacrifice as he deals with the great problem that faces our whole world, the sinful wickedness of humanity. Now, what about routes to power? You know, one day they're going to ask about Trump. How did he get to power? Maybe they're asking that already. As either Boris or Jacob or Corbyn or whoever it happens to be succeeds Theresa May, they're going to be saying to themselves, well, how did they get to power? How did Jesus get to this position of all power? As the sinless Son of God, God the Son, goes to the cross to drink the cup of the wrath of God against the sinful wickedness of humanity, seated on the throne of all power, calling people to himself from every nation, tribe, and tongue, is this silent, suffering servant, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now it's time to apply this in the last few moments, and there's just one, I think, general application. You know, when you pick up the papers tomorrow and you read about yet another abuse of power, yet another self-serving tyrant, whether democratically elected or self-imposed, and you shrug your shoulders and say, well, there's yet another human despot. We have a king, selfless, sacrificial servant, who has been enthroned by God because he willingly went to the cross to carry our sin and drink the cup of God's wrath. We could meditate on this for another hour and a half, couldn't we, publicly like this? The difference of King Jesus from the Gentiles and rulers of the nations who lord it over them, and the great ones who exercise authority over us, and the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who is seated at the right hand of power, who has come on the clouds and will come on the clouds, and what a glorious privilege it is to be part of his kingdom, if you are part of his kingdom and have submitted yourself to his rule. It is beautiful. But did you notice to whom verse 64 is addressed? Just have a quick look at the beginning of we'll take it from verse 62 of Matthew chapter 26. The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand." So to the high priest, to the Jewish establishment, to those who represent the first century temple and first century Judaism, from now on it will quickly become apparent in the events even of the next few weeks, not to mention the subsequent growth of the church, that this so-called blasphemer who is standing in front of them is in fact now in the position of supreme authority. That the priests and the Sanhedrin and the 71 will from now on become a complete irrelevance. That the temple, which they're trying to preserve as a center of divine activity, will be destroyed, never to be rebuilt. That the city of Jerusalem from now on will be overrun because they stand on the wrong side of history as they crucify God's Messiah. That the Jews of Jesus' day, who had accused him of being the great messianic impostor, will find themselves to be the great abusers of power, who slaughtered God's eternal king. And in their eyes, this pretender of unspeakable arrogance is actually God's eternal ruler. And he had claimed that he would replace the temple at Jerusalem and that everything that the temple stood for. And he will bring about the possibility of the presence of God and pardon from God and the praise of God. And from his enthronement, the Jerusalem temple and the Jerusalem city and the people of Israel, understood as the people of God through whom God is uniquely at work, will no longer be the center of divine activity. And Jesus now reigns at the right hand of God and is gathering people from all over the globe and down through history. And the temple is an irrelevance, and Jerusalem as a city is redundant. And pardon from God and the presence of God is being experienced by people from every tribe and nation through the risen and ascended King Jesus, the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. The Sanhedrin, redundant, the wrong side of history. And finally, to us disciples, enthroned in heaven, seated at the right hand of power, is the King of Kings who died to drink the cup of God's wrath at your failure and mine. And next week we're going to spend a whole week looking at Peter's failure, representative disciple. And we're going to see his failure in loyalty and his failure in courage before a servant girl and his failure in integrity as he lied and lied and lied. And we're going to see his considered failure. As he paused, there was a wait, and then he failed again. And we're going to see his repeated failure again and again and again. And we're going to see Peter, the best of men, failing. Peter, the lead disciple, the rock on whom the church is built, his teaching, failing. And so we're going to learn that for the disciple, seated at the right hand of God the Father is the one who died. And there is hope as we come to this ruler, King Jesus, for even the most hopeless, frail, and feeble of us. Let's pray. We bow before you, King Jesus, and praise you for what appears to humans to be the weakness and folly of the cross, but what is in truth the power and wisdom of God. That in your grace and goodness you became a human being, that you went to your death on the cross to drink the cup of God's wrath at our sin, so that we might be brought into the presence of God to enjoy his pardon and to live for his praise. And we do long that this perfect, flawless rule of King Jesus might extend across the globe and down through history. And we pray that you would help us this morning and through this coming week to grow in our sense of adoration and joy at knowing King Jesus. We ask it in his name. Amen.